Our speaker today is Sandy Josephson, who is on the screen. Sandy is the author of Giroux's Journey, The Life and Music of Gerry Mulligan, published in 2015, and Jazz Notes Interviews Across the Generations, published in 2009. He's currently the editor of Jersey Jazz magazine, which is published by the New Jersey Jazz Society. He has also written extensively about jazz musicians in publications ranging from New York Daily News to American Way magazine, and he is the vice president of publicity for the New Jersey Jazz Society, of which I might add, I'm also a member and in fact, former president. Sandy currently co-hosts the Jazz on the Sunday Afternoon Concert series at the J. and Linda Grunin Center for the Arts in Toms River, New Jersey. From 2011 to 17, he curated the Music in the Moonlight Jazz series at the Luna Stage in West Orange, New Jersey, a series that he had founded. Sandy also produced the Flemington, New Jersey segment of the Central Jersey Jazz Festival from 2014 to 2016. Other jazz-related programs and presentations by Sandy include the following: speaker at the virtual Ocean County Teen Arts Festival at the Ocean County College this past March, speaker at Jazz Art Project's Talking Jazz series in Red Bank in April 2017, moderator of a panel on Gerry Mulligan's influence at the Los Angeles Jazz Institute's Mulliganesque Conference held in 2017, and the list goes on and on. He has presented programs at book events at several public libraries and bookstores, including the Ocean County Library in Toms River, the West Orange Public Library, New City Public Library, Words Bookstore in Maplewood, and Barnes & Noble in Livingston. In July 2016, Sandy retired as Director of Public Relations and Development at the Matheny Medical and Educational Center, a special hospital and educational facility in PPAC for children and adults with medically complex developmental disabilities. While at Matheny, he was instrumental in promoting its Arts Access program, which enables people with disabilities to create fine art encompassing visual art, dance choreography, drama, and writing. In 2018, Sandy was contracted by Matheny to write a series of articles and press releases about Arts Access in connection with the program's 25th anniversary. These articles appeared in several news outlets, including the New Jersey Stage, the Asbury Park Press, mycentralnewjersey.com, Burnsville News, TapIntoNet, and Patch.com. He continues to work as a PR consultant for Matheny's Art Access program. Sandy and his wife, Linda, currently reside in Manchester, New Jersey. Sandy, take it away.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Welcome. Joel, before I start speaking, could you play like the first minute, 40 seconds of the first video? Yes, thank you. In 1965, I was living on a U.S. Army base in Japan, working in public information for the American Red Cross. And I purchased that album, Mulligan 63, the concert jazz band in the PX, and I proceeded to wear it out on my turntable. But actually be another 9 years before I was able to see Gerry Mulligan in person at Gerry Mulligan Chet Baker reunion concert at Carnegie Hall. But I think it's safe to say that was the first of many, many performances I saw over the next 2+ decades. I was fortunate enough to interview Gerry in 1981 at his home in Darien, Connecticut for a newspaper article. And 30 years later, although I had met her once, I contacted his wife, Franca, because I felt that no one had yet written a book chronicling his huge contributions to jazz and American music. Fortunately, Franca and I visited her in Darien, and she agreed to lend me 14 tapes of Gerry's oral autobiography, which was recorded in 1995, a year before he died. And she also gave me a copy of a video documentary called Listen, Gerry Mulligan, and she introduced me to a publisher, Hal Leonard Books. That material was supplemented by more than 40 interviews with people who had either played with Gerry or had been influenced by him. And I also added numerous excerpts from books, articles, reviews, and liner notes. And I did see the presentation, your presentation a few weeks ago by Vincent Piloti of the Institute for Jazz Studies at Rutgers Newark. And I have to say, most of that, practically all of that material came from there. And that's an incredible place. The only danger is you go there I went there to research Gerry Mulligan. I start reading a downbeat magazine from 1950, and I get carried away and start reading articles that have nothing to do, with what I was researching. But I just want to give a shout out to Vincent because it's an incredible place. But anyway, so what I'm going to try to do today is to trace Gerry's career from his early days arranging for big bands to his enormous contribution to Miles Davis's classic Birth of the Cool recording, to his superstardom in the 50s and 60s as the leader of a pianoless quartet and the concert jazz band that you just heard, and to his place as one of the giants of American music. Before I get started, though, I want to read to you two articles that were written about Gerry that I think really put his importance into perspective. The first one was written by the Los Angeles Times' Don Heckman shortly after Gerry died in 1996 at the age of 69. Mulligan, Heckman wrote, appeared to be taken for granted by the jazz world. Part of the problem, of course, was his versatility. Soloist, band leader, composer, arranger, and songwriter. He touched all of the important musical bases, inspiring other musicians from the beginning. And Mulligan's sound on baritone saxophone was immediately recognizable. A rich, warm, inviting timbre, smooth and flowing in ballads, overflowing with energy and vigor in up-tempos. It was a sound that spoke always irresistibly in the dialect of the urgent, propulsive swing that is at the heart of jazz. The other article was written in January of 1989. Mulligan was interviewed by Downbeat Magazine's Michael Bourne, who some of you may know as a current personality on WBGO Jazz Radio. But Michael Bourne asked Mulligan when he'd known he would become a musician. And Mulligan's answer was, it was conditioned in me from childhood to have a band, to write for bands, to play with bands. I have a feeling that no matter what era I lived in, 100 years ago or 100 years from now, I'd always be interested in orchestration. It's one of those things that's a mystery to anybody who doesn't have an ear or talent for orchestration. Why does some kid come along and know how it's done? And when I was a kid, I knew how it was done and I wanted to do it. Now, I don't like to use the word genius loosely, but when we talk about people like Duke Ellington or Aaron Copland or George Gershwin, I believe, and it's one of the motivations for writing this book, that Gerry Mulligan belongs in the same conversation. It was often said about Mulligan, in fact, I think he said it about himself, that he aimed for 42nd Street and ended up on 52nd Street. And that's sort of his way of saying that he would have been just as comfortable in the Broadway musical theater as he was in the world of jazz. And later you'll see why he was also comfortable in the world of classical music. But just to give you a brief glimpse into his life, his early life, Gerry Mulligan, he was the youngest of 4 brothers. His father was an engineer, and so the family moved around a lot as his father changed jobs. He was born in Queens Village, New York, and subsequently lived in Marion, Ohio, Chicago, Kalamazoo, Michigan, Detroit, Reading, Pennsylvania, and finally in Philadelphia. And while he was a student at West Philadelphia Catholic High School, he approached a band leader by the name of Johnny Warrington, who led a 30-piece orchestra on Philadelphia radio station WCAU. Warrington also wrote many of the stock arrangements that music publishers sold during that period. And he said to Warrington, "I'd like to write for your band." Mulligan recalled Warrington's reaction. He laughed and said, "Why not?" So that was the beginning of my professional career as an arranger. Shortly after that, Mulligan dropped out of high school and was hired as an arranger for a band led by Tommy Tucker. Now, Tommy Tucker's band was not a jazz band. It was a sweet band. They had one big hit, I Don't Want to Set the World on Fire. Mulligan arranged for Tommy Tucker for 3 months, but he didn't last there because his arrangements were too jazzy for the band leader. So from there, he went to a band led by Elliott Lawrence, and then he moved on to bands led by Gene Krupa and Claude Thornhill. He was doing mostly arranging, although he could certainly have played, but he was too young looking to play in the band. But eventually, he started subbing for someone who was sick or didn't show up, playing clarinet and all kinds of saxophones. But it was while he was playing with Gene Krupa's big band that he became interested in the baritone saxophone. And what he said was, I was really fascinated with the role that the baritone played in the band. A lot of the arrangers I liked used it in a way that was very melodic. And Ellington wrote the top line, the melody line, for the trumpet. And he wrote a bottom line that was for the baritone. And there was a lot of contrary motion in those two lines. That means the baritone was essential to the ensemble. And I liked that very much. And shortly after that, Mulligan sold all of his horns, except for the baritone. When he moved to Claude Thornhill's band, some of his bandmates were pianist Gil Evans, alto saxophonist Lee Konitz, and tuba player Bill Barber. And while he was working with Thornhill, Mulligan began hanging out at Gil Evans' West 55th Street apartment. And that's when arrangements Mulligan and Evans wrote for Thornhill began to shape the eventual creation of The Birth of the Cool Nonet, led, of course, by Miles Davis. A composer, George Russell, described the atmosphere in the Evans apartment to writer Nate Hentoff this way. A very big bed took up a lot of the place. There was one big lamp and a cat named Becky. The linoleum was battered and there was a little court outside. Inside, it was always very dark. The feeling of the room was timelessness. Whenever you went there, you wouldn't care about the conditions outside. You couldn't tell whether it was day or night, summer or winter, and it didn't matter. At all hours, the place was loaded with people who came in and out. When the writing began, it was Davis, Mulligan said, who really was the practical one. He really had a desire to have his own band and make a place for himself in the music scene. He loved the Claude Thornhill band, and so he was the one who started making the phone calls and getting the players together and reserving the rehearsal studios and generally assuming the role of the leader. If it had been left to the rest of us, we'd have kept on theorizing and writing and never getting around to doing anything. Now, the Capitol Records album that was released 8 years later was actually recorded in 3 different sessions. 4 of the 6 horns were the same on all 3 sessions. Miles Davis on trumpet, Barber on tuba, Lee Konitz on alto sax, and Mulligan on baritone. J.J. Johnson played trombone on 2 sessions, Kai Winding on the other. 3 different French horn players, Junior Collins, Sandy Siegelstein, and Gunther Schuller. It's a very funny story in my book about how Miles Davis went to visit Gunther Schuller at the Metropolitan Opera to convince him to play on one of the sessions. Max Roach and Kenny Clark were the 2 drummers. Al Haig and John Lewis alternated on piano. And there were 3 different bassists, Joe Schulman, Nelson Boyd, and Al McKibben. The vocal on Darn That Dream was sung by Kenny Haygood. Now, when people talk about Birth of the Cool, they mention Miles Davis and they mention Gil Evans. But Gerry Mulligan actually wrote 3 and arranged 6 of the 12 tunes that are on the album. As John Newsom, retired chief of the music division of the Library of Congress, said, Miles Davis was brilliant, and Gil Evans went on and did absolutely fantastic things. But those classic recordings are more Gerry than anybody else. And the Chicago Tribune's Howard Reich wrote, were it not for Mulligan, the obscure 1949-1950 recordings that years later would be relaunched as Miles Davis's seminal Birth of the Cool album might never have attained their particular melodic luster. Miles Davis gave Gerry the nickname Jeru, and one of the Mulligan compositions on Birth of the Cool was entitled Jeru. So here's a portion of the original Birth of the Cool recording of Jeru, the next video, 1 minute and 50 seconds. Okay, as I said, the album, well, the music, the Birth of the Cool band didn't get a lot of attention in 1949 and 50 when they actually made the recording. They made a couple of live appearances and got really very little attention. It was 8 years later before it was recorded by Capitol and then became a classic. So Mulligan actually hitchhiked out to California after the recording was done, or after the couple of performances were done. Got a job arranging for Stan Kenton. He played at a place called the Lighthouse in Hermosa Beach. And then he got hired for the off night at a small jazz club in the Wilshire section of Los Angeles called The Hague. Now, originally, the main attraction at The Hague was Errol Garner, and the club had a grand piano for him. But the next engagement was the Red Norvo trio, Norvo on vibes, Red Mitchell on bass, and Tal Farlow on guitar. No piano. Mulligan talked about that in my 1981 interview with him, and he said, they said for the off night they would get a little spinet or something that didn't take up much room and wasn't expensive. I said, forget it. I'll put together a group without a piano. Well, the quartet he put together was himself, of course, on baritone saxophone, Chet Baker on trumpet, Chico Hamilton on drums, and Bob Whitlock on bass. It was an instant success, playing what Mulligan described as improvised counterpoint, having two horns operate over the bass line. Mulligan remembered the Hague experience as a phenomenal thing. We found ourselves with lines outside, people waiting to get in. Time magazine wrote, the hot topic in Los Angeles last week was the cool jazz of a gaunt, hungry-looking young fellow named Gerry Mulligan, who plays the baritone saxophone. For the past 3 months, Mulligan's quartet has been performing in a nightclub known as The Hague, and he was drawing the biggest crowds in the club's history. Here's the Gerry Mulligan pianoless quartet playing a Mulligan composition called Walkin' Shoes. Well, the pianoless quartet lasted until the late 1950s. After Baker left, he was replaced by valve trombonist Bob Brookmeyer and then by flugelhornist Art Farmer. When Brookmeyer was asked about playing with Mulligan, he said it was much like playing with Bach might have been. The strength of his lines, he always seemed to have the right lines in the right place, at the right time, the right way. Farmer pointed out that his previous group was led by pianist Art Silver, a very strong pianist. But when I got on stage to play with the quartet, he said, and the quartet started playing, I felt like I was in a dream, like you're walking down the street with no clothes on. Speaking of Art Farmer, at the end of this presentation, I'll give you a little more information about the New Jersey Jazz Society and our magazine. And the cover story of the October Jersey Jazz magazine is on a tribute to Art Farmer that's going to be held at William Patterson University on October 24th. But to move on, I should point out that in the 1940s and 50s, Mulligan had an on-again, off-again drug problem, primarily with heroin. And although the exact timing isn't clear, sometime during the late 1950s, he finally beat his drug habit after he and tenor saxophonist Zoot Sims saved the life of a young musician who nearly died from an overdose. So the next day, Mulligan said, I decided I'd simply had it. I didn't want to have anything more to do with any of it. We were in Detroit. We were supposed to go to Chicago next. I called my agent and said, cancel out Chicago. Don't book me with this group anymore. And if you want me, I'll be in the hospital. I put myself in a clinic in New York for a couple of weeks, and that was the end of it. In the late 1950s, Mulligan began to organize what became his concert jazz band. And this was at a time when big bands were beginning to decline in popularity. As a matter of fact, the big band era had virtually ended by then. But the timing for Mulligan couldn't have been better. Metronome magazine held a readers' poll to find out who the most popular jazz musicians were. Mulligan finished third behind Charlie Parker and Miles Davis. The instrumentation of the concert jazz band was 3 trumpets, Brookmeyer's valve trombone, plus 2 slide trombones, 4 reeds, clarinet, alto saxophone, tenor saxophone, baritone saxophone, plus Mulligan's solo baritone saxophone, and a rhythm section of bass and drums. Again, no piano, but occasionally Mulligan or Brookmeyer would sit down at the piano. The sound of the concert jazz band, according to bassist Bill Crow, was a blending of all the different colors, like the weaving of a tapestry. The closest to it before was Claude Thornhill or some of the classical composers like Debussy and Ravel. I'd never heard a band like that before. Alan Raff, a slide trombonist who was in the band and who I spoke to when I was researching my book, said the musicality between Mulligan and Brookmeyer was impeccable. The playing of the ensemble was pretty much the same every night, but the solos were different. They changed tremendously, and the backgrounds to the solos changed. It was the absolute highest level of jazz playing. Now, originally, the band included 3 West Coast players, drummer Mel Lewis, bassist Buddy Clark, and trumpeter Conti Condoli. But when the band moved east, Lewis stayed with the band, but when Clark and Condoli left, they were succeeded by Bill Crow on bass and Clark Terry on trumpet. Their first recording with those 2 musicians was an album called Live at the Village Vanguard. In the liner notes, Nat Hentoff described the first tune, Art Farmer's Blueport. Bill Crow's bass solo, he wrote, leads into a crackling series of exchanges between Gerry Mulligan and Clark Terry. Mulligan takes the first 4-bar breaks with an 8-bar answer from Terry. The process is then reversed. The dialogue is a contest of wit as well as quick fingering imagination. And there are a couple of places where the 2 jousters nearly break each other up. Now, the track of Blueport is 11 minutes long, and we're not going to do that. But here are the first 2 minutes and 36 seconds of Blueport from the album Live at the Village Vanguard. Okay, I mentioned bassist Bill Crow. Bassist Bill Crow will be celebrating his 94th birthday, I think in December, and he's still very much active on the jazz scene. As a matter of fact, the cover of our June magazine was on a group called the Generations of Jazz Trio that Bill is in, along with a 19-year-old pianist by the name of Leoniki Schäuble and her father, 58-year-old Nick Schäuble. So he's an incredible guy. And he writes a column in every other issue of our magazine called From the Crow's Nest. In the beginning, the concert jazz band had the financial support of Verve Records and its president, Norman Granz, who recorded it live in several locations and booked it literally all over the world. But in 1961, Granz sold Verve to MGM Records and the financial arrangement ended. And so Mulligan broke up the band as a continuous group, but he was able to reassemble it from time to time up until around 1964. From 1965 to 1968, Mulligan's career was somewhat unstructured. He played in Europe with different European rhythm sections. He played with pianist Hampton Hawes, and he made some recordings for Mercury Records. But in 1968, George Wein, the founder of the Newport Jazz Festival, who passed away recently at the age of 95, brought Mulligan together with Dave Brubeck. Paul Desmond had just left Brubeck's quartet. So Mulligan and Brubeck first played together at a festival in New Orleans, and the chemistry between them was natural and very, very relaxed. Said Mulligan, I was the saxophone player who came to dinner. It was great for me because after all those years of being the leader and having to worry about getting the airline tickets, it was great. You just aimed me in the right direction and I was there. Ween told me that he felt the association with Brubeck was a good respite from band leading for Mulligan. If Gerry was coming to play with other people, Ween said, he would be having a ball. But when he had his own band and had to perform, he became a different person. He was so tense. He wanted everything to be so correct. He was a perfectionist with his own group, not just with the music, but with every single thing with it. As I said, the rapport with Mulligan and Brubeck was natural, and actually they became very, very good friends. So for a complete change of pace, here they are performing Santa Claus is Coming to Town. So I think you get a feeling for the rapport that the two had for each other. In the early 70s, Mulligan did get the itch again to put his own band together. And he put together a sextet that was the antithesis of the pianoless quartet. Electric piano, guitar, bass, drums, and percussion, plus his baritone or sometimes soprano saxophone. And then sometimes he would add 4 horns on the front line, and sometimes he would add 2 more trumpets and 2 more trombones. He called this the Age of Steam Band, and there was an album called The Age of Steam. But the spirit of the sextet was captured by John Wilson of the New York Times in a review of its performance at a Greenwich Village jazz club called Hoppers. The group, Wilson wrote, is a reflection of Mr. Mulligan's personality, relaxed, slyly humorous, but in performance, totally involved. It's a refreshing and provocative addition to jazz. Now, in 1974, Mulligan was on a trip to Italy, and he met Franca Rota, who became his wife. They eventually married and spent the next 22 years together. In addition to their personal relationship, their relationship had a major impact on Mulligan's career going forward. In 1978, Mulligan decided to revive a version of the concert jazz band. I wanted to have my own band again, he said. Franca was really the prime mover because she realized that's what I wanted to do, but I was hesitant to take this on again. Franca realized how hard it was for me to sell myself to agents and promoters. But when she started dealing with these people, my whole relationship with agents changed. They didn't have me, the easy pushover anymore. Franca, though, knew when to draw the line. I didn't want to make any decisions that dealt with the music, she told me. I had nothing to do with the hiring and firing or the quality of the musicians. Those were all Gerry's decisions. But after Mulligan assembled the musicians, they had a unique opportunity to rehearse at the Club Med in Guadeloupe. It was a holiday for the musicians, Franca said. The people that were there, the vacationers, were outside this big room all week, listening to the band rehearsing. And then the last night, the band performed. It was great. The musicians were absolutely together. Now, there's a lot of fascinating stories about the courtship between Gerry Mulligan and Franca, but you'll have to read my book to learn about those. The band was an expanded version of the concert jazz band. Mulligan added a 4th trumpet and a 5th saxophone. He felt it gave the possibility of a much more loud ensemble and one that was geared really more to the concert hall than to the festival atmosphere. And he said, I added a piano, which makes it a lot easier for the rhythm section. So altogether, it was a quite different sounding band. And it was a mix of young musicians, lead trumpeter Laurie Frink in those days. That was very unusual to have a female in the brass section. A trombonist, Keith O'Quinn, who's still around playing with the Maria Schneider Jazz Orchestra. And then veterans such as trumpeter Tom Harrell, and the trombonist Alan Raff, who had been in the original concert jazz band. The band toured Europe, and it made an appearance in early 1979 at Storytown, a club George Wein had opened on East 58th Street in New York. And in February 1979, Downbeat magazine described that performance as refreshing and alive with some of the finest side people Mulligan could muster. Now, in June of 1979, my wife Linda and I attended a performance at Carnegie Hall, part of the Newport Jazz Festival in New York. And the concert was billed as, the first half was Mel Torme, and the second half was the Gerry Mulligan Quartet. But when the curtain rose, it was not the Gerry Mulligan Quartet. It was the new Gerry Mulligan Concert Jazz Band. And I have to say, it was one of the most memorable concerts I have ever attended. The drummer arranger, Richie DeRosa, was working at as Mulligan's assistant at the time, and he became the band's drummer. Mulligan's writing, DeRosa said, was very adventurous. It was bebop, it was swing, it was classical, it was improvised, it was everything. When we played with Gerry, he would call it a show. We weren't just playing notes. We were playing like a chef preparing a meal. The pacing was very important. With Gerry, every tune he selected was a new place to go. It was a big stylistic journey, and no matter where it went, there was always a melodic thread. Now, unfortunately, that band only made one album, Walk on the Water, recorded in 1980, but it won a Grammy Award for Best Jazz Instrumental Performance. 5 of the tunes were Mulligan originals. One tune, Angelica, was written by his pianist, Mitchell Foreman, and the George Bassman Net Washington Standard, I'm Getting Sentimentally Over You, completed the album. So here's a portion of a live performance of the new concert jazz band at the North Sea Jazz Festival in the Netherlands. This was in 1982. This is the title tune of the album, Walk on the Water, with Gerry playing soprano saxophone. And I think I said, I'm not sure if I said 2 minutes and 26 seconds or 3 minutes and 23 seconds, but whatever. Joel, just let it play. Mulligan was initially reluctant to delve too seriously into the world of classical music, but the real turning point in his involvement with classical music came on a chance meeting with Zubin Mehta, then conductor of the New York Philharmonic, on a cross-country flight from Los Angeles to New York, also in 1982. As a result, Mehta invited Mulligan to play Ravel's Bolero on soprano saxophone with the symphony orchestra, which he did in May of 1982. The Christian Science Monitor's Thor Eckert Jr. attended the concert, and he wrote that there was something startling, electrifying about the saxophone solo in the weekend performances of Ravel's Bolero that Zubin Mehta directed to close the New York Philharmonic season. The tune rang out with blazing authority. It was played with a freedom, a nuance, an insinuating thrust that one hardly expects from a classical player and that one almost never encounters in any orchestra. At the end, when the soloists stood for their bows, the reason that sax solo had been so noteworthy was revealed. No one quite looks like the white-bearded and maned Gerry Mulligan, one of jazz's greats, and no one sounds like him either. In December of 1989, about 7.5 years later, Mulligan and his quartet performed his Entente for saxophone and orchestra and K4 Pacific, one of the tunes he wrote for the Age of Steam album, in 4 performances with the New York Philharmonic at Avery Fisher Hall. The rhythm section was Bill Charlap on piano, a very young Bill Charlap at that time, Dean Johnson on bass, and Richie DeRosa on drums. And there's a story that Franca told me, not sure how accurate it was, but it's a good story, so I'll tell it to you. She said that there were 4 elderly ladies, very enthusiastic, giving Mulligan's group a standing ovation at the end of their second piece. And he told Mulligan, he said, "Those old ladies never gave me a standing ovation before." So again, I don't know if that's a true story or not, but Franca believes it was. So in 1991, Mulligan decided he wanted to do a rebirth of the Cool recording. And he hoped that Miles Davis would be a part of it, but Davis passed away in September of that year, and before the recording was made. So his place was taken by a Davis protege, trumpeter Wallace Roney. There were two members of the original No-Net, in addition to Mulligan, pianist John Lewis and tuba player Bill Barber. I was living in West Orange at the time, working on my book, and I knew that Wallace Roney lived in Clifton, so I thought it should be relatively easy for me to interview him. And I kept emailing him, and he kept saying, "Yeah, great, great," but I was never able to nail him down to a time or a date. And then I was almost given up, and I'm lying in bed about 11 o'clock on a Friday night, and the phone rings. My wife answers it, and she says, "It's for you." And it was Wallace Roney calling from Europe, where it was 5 o'clock in the morning. But he told me about the making of Rebirth of the Cool. We got together to rehearse, he said, and it was really funny because we played Boplicity, which was one of the tunes written by Miles Davis. Miles had taught me this way of playing. I didn't play it the way it was written. I played it the way Miles taught me to phrase it. And Gerry was amazed. He said, "How did you know that?" And I looked up into the sky and said, "Thanks to Miles." Miles had told me that he loved Gerry. Roney described Mulligan as brilliant. "I learned some very cool things from him," he said. "My heroes were Miles Davis, John Coltrane, Red Garland, Herbie Hancock, Tony Williams, Wayne Shorter, Charlie Parker, Dizzy Gillespie, Ornette Coleman. Those were my heroes, geniuses." I added Gerry Mulligan to this list because I saw him display his genius. I saw him take an arrangement, tear it apart, and redo it right there. He heard every part in his head. He would reorchestrate it, not just the notes, but the moving parts. This man can hear. I would be hard-pressed to estimate the number of times I saw Gerry Mulligan in concert at either Carnegie Hall or Lincoln Center, at Hoppers or Storytown, at the Bottom Line, the South Street Seaport, or wherever he surfaced. But one particularly memorable night was a Two Generations of Brubeck concert in the late 70s. Brubeck and his sons played in the first half, and the second half featured the Dave Brubeck Trio with special guests Paul Desmond and Gerry Mulligan. Then when the two concerts were over, everyone came out for an encore, and of course, Gerry took over as the leader of the band. He was no longer the guest soloist. He was leading his own band again extemporaneously and enjoying it immensely. In early January of 1996, Mulligan played aboard a Caribbean jazz cruise on the SS Norway. Several of his friends, alto saxophonist Phil Woods, composer Johnny Mandel, and the writer Gene Lees were on the cruise. Woods performed the same week as Gerry. Mandel just came along as a passenger. Lees wrote about the experience in his book, Arranging the Score, Portraits of the Great Arrangers. Talking about Mulligan, he hobbled on stage and sat on a stool, and the quartet began to play. It was one of the best groups Gerry ever had, and it was some of the finest and most inventive playing I ever heard from him in the 36 years of our friendship, not to mention the years long before we met, when his LPs were high on the list of my favorite records. Woods described it to me as one of the most brilliant performances ever. We all knew he was sick and wasn't going to be around much longer. We were just awestruck at the depth of emotion that poured out of his baritone. It was one of the greatest performances of any artist that I've ever heard. Mandel added, everyone was reduced to tears, not because it was so sad, but because it was so beautiful. Gerry had transcended himself. The rhythm section playing with Gerry on that cruise were members of his last quartet: Ted Rosenthal on piano, Dean Johnson on bass, and Ron Vincent on drums. Recalling those performances, Rosenthal told me that we never dreamed this could be one of our last gigs with him. Mulligan actually passed away on January 20th of 1996. Dean Johnson and Ron Vincent, the bassist and drummer from that quartet, have actually formed a Gerry Mulligan tribute quintet, and I was lucky enough to have them perform at the Grunin Center in Toms River in the fall of 2019. So if you see anything about them, I would highly recommend that you see them play. Of all the tributes that poured in after Mulligan's death, perhaps the most noteworthy was a letter Franca received from President Bill Clinton. "Dear Franca," he wrote, "Hillary and I were deeply saddened by Gerry's death, and our hearts go out to you at this difficult time. Gerry truly made a difference during his lifetime. He was a brilliant innovator in the world of jazz, advancing and expanding his craft and leaving a powerful legacy that musicians and jazz lovers will long admire and study. As you know, he was an inspiration to me from the time I was a young man." That was the typewritten portion of the letter, but below it, in Clinton's handwriting, was this additional note: "No one ever played the horn the way he did, and no one ever will." I don't have a video of the jazz cruise performance, but we do have one from a concert in Japan with the same rhythm section: Ted Rosenthal on piano, Dean Johnson on bass, and Ron Vincent on drums. It's a performance of Duke Ellington's Satin Doll. Mike Katz, I think you'll agree, that looks like Ted Rosenthal's bar mitzvah. He looks so young, but anyway, those are the end of my prepared remarks. I did want to tell you or direct you, if you're not a member of the New Jersey Jazz Society, go to njjs.org. The magazine, the current magazine in its entirety, is only available to members, but I'm giving you the password. It's Satin Doll, so if you want to click on the October magazine and read it, you can do that. And also, if for some reason you want to buy my book, it is available at Amazon, BarnesandNoble.com, or Roman.com, ROWMAN.com, which is the author. And I'm glad to take any pictures or comments or complaints or whatever from this point on.
Okay. Anyone who has a question, raise your hands. I see Al Hale has his hand up already. Al, go ahead.
Sandy, thank you very much for a fabulous presentation. I'm curious as to what you think makes jazz so popular. Is it the melody, the harmony, the rhythm, the improvisation, or the artistry?
Okay, well, it's a combination of all those, but I think the the rapport and improvisation among the musicians is one of the things that to me is so incredible, because you can go to a performance sometimes where they haven't had it. I mean, they're not that they don't rehearse; they do rehearse a lot, but many times there'll be for whatever reason, a musician shows up at the last minute as a substitute for somebody else, and it's almost like they can read each other's minds. I mean, so I think that's part of it. Now, jazz, unfortunately, really is much more popular in Europe and Asia than it is in the United States, particularly today. Why that is, we could spend a long time, exploring that. But and I think at certain times in jazz's history, particularly perhaps in the 60s, many of the musicians became too concerned with playing for each other and not playing for the audience, and they lost a lot of listeners. But I think also another thing that I think is very attractive is the way a jazz musician can take the melody of a very familiar song, play the melody, veer away from the melody, and then sneak back into it without you realizing it. I don't know if I really answered your question, but I became passionate about jazz when I lived in Japan in the 60s. And
it's a fabulous genre.
yeah, I think so. And I'm not a musician at all, so I'm in awe of these guys.
Okay, Rich Jager, please.
Thank you very much, Sandy. My question is about the clip that you showed of Gerry Mulligan and Chet Baker playing Walking Shoes. And to my ear, which is not very well attuned to jazz, it sounded like a very well rehearsed and performed piece, as though they were playing it just the way they rehearsed it. Do you know how much they were actually improvising during that piece rather than?
Okay, well, yeah, that was on the recording, and they may have played it straight the way that that Gerry arranged it. That's a good question. I think it's interesting where they talk about. You can see the same jazz performance several times of the same song by the same musicians, and it'll be different every time. And sometimes they stick to the arrangement, and other times, for whatever reason, they decide to veer from the arrangement. So I don't know specifically on that particular recording, but I think you're right. I think they pretty much stuck to the arrangement there. Whereas, and also, I think you'll also find that there's a big difference between live performances and recorded performances. And I think this is only an opinion of mine, but I think they would tend to improvise more when they're performing before an audience than when they're in the recording studio.
Thank you very much.
Sure.
Mort O'Shea?
Hi, Sandy. Great presentation. I
Thank
wonder, did Gerry Mulligan benefit financially from his talent, or was it a struggle for him at the end?
No, I think he did very well. I don't know the details of his finances, but I think when the 50s, of course, he was what would be the equivalent of a superstar today, and then he was very popular in Europe, and he spent when I interviewed him in 1981, he was spending a portion of Franca was Italian, but he was spending a portion of the year in Italy. So he had two homes. One of them might have been Franca's. But no, I think he was very comfortable. I don't know when that transition took place, but I would say that he was a success financially as well as artistically. And he did a lot. I didn't even get into this. I talk about it a lot in the book. He did a lot of scoring for motion pictures as well. As a matter of fact, one of the things, there was a movie called I Want to Live with Susan Hayward, which Susan Hayward won the Academy Award for. And Johnny Mandel actually did the score, but the Mulligan Quartet appeared at the beginning of the movie, and the Mulligan Quartet played on the soundtrack. And as a matter of fact, the woman that Susan Hayward portrayed, who was a real life figure, who was in jail and going to receive the death sentence, there's a scene in the movie where she's playing, the radio's playing, and the guard says to her, "That sounds like jazz." And she said, "Yeah, that's Gerry Mulligan. I have all of his records." But what I'm saying is that I think he benefited financially from a lot of the scoring he did for motion pictures.
Thank you.
It's now 11:30. Sandy, could you stick around for a little bit?
Oh, sure.
Okay, great. Next question, Ron Weininger.
Yeah, hi. That was very good. I had a problem with Zoom at the end and couldn't see the last concert. But anyway, you mentioned that Gerry Mulligan arranged for Gene Krupa band.
Yes.
After Krupa left Goodman, he seemed to go more into sweet music than jazz. Could you briefly comment on that, or did I miss something on the number of Krupa?
Well, I think Krupa. I'm not all that familiar with Krupa. It's interesting you should mention that, because the current issue of Jazz Times magazine has a cover story, which I just started reading, which is fascinating to me, also because I lived in Japan. But it's a story about the Gene Krupa trio going to Japan in 1952 And it talks about the fact that Krupa, after he left Mulligan, did have a successful big band. And then, but the trio was part of the big band. And then when they went to Japan in 1952, they were the first American jazz group to go to Japan, and they were an incredible success. So I don't know if that answered your question, but that, you know, other than that, I'm not, you know, I'm not, you know, as familiar obviously with Krupa as I would be with Mulligan. But, you know, Mulligan also talked about how he learned a great deal from Krupa, and Krupa used to have some of the musicians in his hotel room with a portable record player, and he would play classical music for them because he thought that they should know and appreciate classical music. That's just an aside, but again, I don't know if I completely answered your question, but.
Marcel Simon?
Yeah. Hi, how are you? Thank you for a very informative presentation. It was terrific.
Thank you.
I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on Mulligan's influence on later baritone players. I'm thinking people like Hamlet Blewett or Patience Higgins, or contemporary players like Lauren Sevian or Claire Daly, folks like that.
Okay, in my book, I actually talked to a number of baritone players, and you mentioned Lauren Sevian and Claire Daly. I spoke to them, and while they say their style may not be the same as Mulligan's, as they said, no one can really play the baritone saxophone without first listening to Gerry Mulligan. So I talked to those two. Gary Smulyan, who is arguably considered the #1 baritone player today, was also someone who I spoke to and said he was greatly influenced by Mulligan. So I would say that while the other baritone player that you hear a lot about, other than Harry Carney, who of course was with the Duke Ellington Orchestra, is Pepper Adams, and Pepper Adams did have a very different style from Gerry Mulligan. So I would say today's baritone players are probably influenced by one or the other.
Right.
But even if they don't play in Gerry Mulligan's style, they will say that you have to listen to Gerry Mulligan if you're a baritone player. The interesting thing about baritone players is most of them don't start out on baritone, and then somehow maybe they have. Gary Smulyan is an example. He was an alto player, and he got a job. I think it was, I forget with whose band it was, and they wanted him to play baritone. So he said, "Okay, I'll do it. I'll learn it." And then he never left the baritone after that.
Right. Great. Thank you. Yeah, very informative.
Herb Woodell?
Yes. Let me add my accolade to the others. Fantastic presentation, educational, entertaining.
Thank you.
I go back to the days of big fat records and very little radio and Dixieland jazz.
Okay.
I always assumed that was 100% can't come up with the word, but spontaneous. Anyone who showed up with an instrument or something that could make rhythmic or harmonic sound was allowed to sit in. And then we had also in my early days, the big bands, swing, and that was definitely arranged. And then we got into modern jazz, which was very sophisticated, almost classical. And am I recalling things correctly, or?
Well, you're right. Yeah, sure. Because from the swing era, we went into the bebop era, where not that the swing era didn't have improvisation, even though they had arrangements. But those guys did improvise. I mean, Louis Armstrong was a great improviser, but it was different. And then you had what they call the cool school, which many people say Gerry Mulligan was part of. But the interesting thing about Mulligan is, even though he was considered a modern jazz player, he had great reverence for the past, and he could jump up and play with a Dixieland band at any moment and enjoy it. And he respected the melody. And there's a story in my book. Jimmy Carter, when he was president, had a jazz festival on the White House lawn, and certain musicians were invited there to play, and others were invited there just to speak. And Mulligan was invited there just to speak, so he didn't bring his horn with him. And when they were at the end of the concert, all of the musicians who were playing were getting up on the stage together to play, and it was killing him that he couldn't play. And he went over to one of the groups, which is the Dukes of Dixieland. The guy was sitting there, and he borrowed his clarinet, jumped up on the stage, and had to play with him. So I think there was a lot of competition and even bitterness, I guess, between the swing players and the bebop players when all that was happening. I think there's less of that today. I think they cross over the lines more today. And my only real criticism is when the musicians begin to get too involved with their own technique and not as involved enough with the audience. But I think there's less of that either or feeling today. I don't know if that was what you were asking
thank you.
about.
That was great.
As a matter of fact, George Wein had a, his club. He had a club called Storyville in Boston, and the upstairs was for modern jazz musicians, and the downstairs was for the more traditional, Dixieland players.
Didier Perron?
Thank you for the presentation. That was really nice. I just have a remark, not so much of a question. I grew up in France in the 50s, 60s, and a little bit the 70s, and all we were listening was jazz. And the remark is that when Gerry Mulligan came in the scene, what we were most surprised was that he was white. We thought to be a good jazz musician, you had to be black. And we had been listening to, Sidney Bechet, all those guys going to all the clubs in Paris, and they were mostly white people, black people. So
that argument is gone, but also, you probably know this, but a lot of black jazz musicians were expatriates in the 50s because they were treated so much better in Europe.
Yes.
So that may be part of it, but yeah, there's an argument about about that. But I think I think you have today very good jazz musicians, black, white, Asian, European. It's
the Italians.
Everybody's music, I think. But
thank you. Really enjoyed it.
I know where you're coming from. But it's interesting too, and in the United States, where it was much less accepted for there to be integrated groups. I mean, there were people that were very courageous. Benny Goodman had Lionel Hampton and Teddy Wilson in his quartet at a time when that was, not accepted. There's a famous jazz trumpeter, Howard McGee, who was the only black trumpeter in Charlie Barnett's band. And when the band checked into a hotel, he had to find another place to stay because the hotel wouldn't check him in. There are all kinds of stories like that. Cab Calloway rented a train when they traveled through the South, and the musicians slept on the train because there was no other place decent that they could stay. So,
wow. Thank you.
Sure.
If there are no other questions, Mike Katz, up to you.
Gerry, thank you very much. That was just a wonderful presentation, and I think if any of the people here weren't jazz fans, they are now. Jazz in general, Gerry Mulligan in particular. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I enjoyed it a lot. Okay.
We have two ways of rewarding our presenters, and one of them is to present you with this certificate of appreciation, which now appears up on the screen.
Okay.
The Old Guard of Summit, New Jersey takes great pleasure in presenting this certificate of appreciation to Sandy Josephson. We're happy to take this way of expressing our gratitude to you for the contribution you have made to our organization. I will send you a copy of this, which I'm sure is suitable for framing.
Okay.
And now, having done that, we want to give you the Old Guard salute, and everybody unmute and round of applause.
Thank you, Sandy.
Hey.
Hey.
So, thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you, Sandy. I'll never listen to Santa Claus is Coming to Town and again.